Welcome to Learning Thursdays. My name is Crystal Hewitt-Gill with the OASAS Learning and Development Unit and your host for today's presentation. Today's presentation is titled, Helping Adults Affected by Another's Gambling, and our presenters are Rachel Loria and Jamie Costello. Rachel Loria has a background in social work. She's worked with families, children in schools, substance abuse, and problem gambling prevention and supportive recovery housing. Rachel is currently the Bureau Director for Treatment and Recovery at the New York Council on Problem Gambling. She enjoys working on program development and helping people reach their goals. Jamie Costello has a background in substance abuse prevention, building community capacity, and training. She is currently the Bureau Director of Prevention and Training at the New York Council on Problem Gambling. She completed her master's in public health with the University of New England and is most passionate about environmental prevention and program planning and evaluation. They will be joining us in just a moment, but first a word about Learning Thursdays. Learning Thursdays are offered to behavioral health professionals as a free learning opportunity with the goal of improving the knowledge and skills of the New York State substance use disorder workforce, as we strive to improve the lives of individuals needing prevention, treatment, and recovery services. A goal of Learning Thursdays is to support the professional development of the treatment, prevention, and recovery workforce. We do this by offering regular presentations that are relevant to today's substance use disorder treatment professionals. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to contact us at the Learning Thursdays mailbox. You can use the same mailbox to express an interest in providing a future Learning Thursdays program. And now, it's time to start the presentation. Welcome to our presenters, Rachel and Jamie.
Hi everyone, I'm Jamie with the New York Council on Problem Gambling, and with me today is Rachel Loria, also from our office. For those of you who haven't heard of the New York Council on Problem Gambling, we are a nonprofit independent corporation dedicated to doing two things. One is increasing public awareness about problem gambling, and the other is to advocate for support services for those who are affected by problem gambling. That includes individuals as well as family members. I do want to point out that the Council, the New York Council on Problem Gambling, we maintain a neutral stance when it comes to gambling. So what that means is that we are not for or against gambling. We're just out to help the people who are struggling and have an issue and need support. Today's webinar is helping adults affected by another person's gambling problem. So we thank you for tuning in today. Mostly what we're going to cover today is the impacts of problem gambling on a spouse or a significant other, as well as parents of adult children who are gamblers. We don't have time today to discuss the impacts of problem gambling on children, but we will be sure to cover that in another program if you choose to put that on your survey or evaluation. We would appreciate that. I'm going to hand it over to Rachel, who's going to cover a little bit of the overview of what we'll talk about today.
Hello. So just a brief overview of today's webinar is what is gambling and what are the stages of the effects of problem gambling on the family. We'll talk about some financial considerations, also co-occurring disorders, and finding help.
So it might seem really basic to talk about what gambling is, but gambling means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. For some folks, you'll say, have you gambled or do you gamble? And they'll say, no, I don't go to the casino, or no, I don't go to the racetrack. So a lot of times it's really important to talk about what gambling is before we talk about the effects of gambling and problem gambling on other folks. Just at a really basic definition, gambling contains three things. We have to risk something of value on a game of chance. So anytime risk is involved, that means you can't guarantee the outcome, right? Or you might actually lose it, excuse me. Risk means you could lose whatever you're putting up. It says value, and it doesn't say money because you're not always risking money. You're risking what's important to you. So for a 6-year-old, that could be Pokemon cards, and for a 40-year-old, that could be $100. So sometimes it's money, sometimes it's not. It could be a watch, could be a house, could be a last name. So you're risking something of value on a game of chance. And what that means is that you cannot guarantee the outcome. Some folks will argue that poker is a game of skill, or horse racing or sports are a game of skill. Those are true, that skill is involved in those, and there's more skill than there is in something like bingo or a scratch-off card. But there's still an element of chance. You still can't guarantee the outcome. So in order for something to really be classified as gambling, you're risking something of value on a game of chance. Typically, when we talk about gambling, it's with the hope of a desired result, either that you'll win something from somebody else or that you'll increase the value of what you already have. So you'll win somebody else's watch or Pokemon cards, or you'll get more of your money back than what you risked in the first place. So think about that in the context as we go along in the webinar today or in the Learning Thursday today, that gambling, as we discuss it, has risk, something of value, and on a game of chance, typically with the hope that you'll win something or a desired result. Now, is everybody gambling? No. There are, in fact, some people who do not gamble at all. About 85% of the US population has gambled at some point in their lives. And so that means that 15% of our adult population has never gambled. Does that mean they're not at risk for developing a gambling problem? No, they're absolutely at risk, specifically when we talk about family members. Gambling, as well as other addictions, really runs really in a family. You see a family history, you're more likely to develop a problem. Also, if you have more access and availability of gambling in your area, you're more likely or you're more at risk to develop a gambling problem. Talk about kids as well as we talk about family members and other people addicted. I know I said we weren't going to cover that today, but youth would be in this category. Even if they're not gambling, they're still at risk. It could be something that's part of their family history, also part of their culture, something that's ingrained in their culture. And then we have what we like to call at-risk gamblers. You may have heard the term social gamblers before. About 60% of Americans have gambled at some point in the last year. That doesn't mean that they're problem gamblers, but they are participating in gambling activity. So what does at-risk gambling look like? These are typically people who go to a gambling event or a gambling venue or participate in a game of poker for entertainment and just as a form of socialization with their friends or with their family members. They don't expect to win. They know that they could lose their money and they're okay and comfortable if they lose their money. They don't hide about their gambling behaviors. But again, we don't call this just social gambling because even those folks can have some sort of risk for developing a gambling problem. So as we continue in the spectrum from non-gamblers to at-risk gamblers, you'll see that problem gamblers. How do we know that it's gone from at-risk gambling to problem gambling? I get asked this question a lot. And the one thing I really try to simplify it down to is if gambling is causing a problem in someone's life, it's a gambling problem. Problem gambling is not an official diagnosis code. That's where we get into gambling disorder. Problem gambling is any time that gambling causes a problem in your life. And about 5% of New Yorkers surveyed have experienced gambling problems in their life in the past year. So that's 5 out of every 100 people. That's 1 out of 20. So if you have 20 friends, it's likely that one of them has experienced a gambling problem before. Again, it doesn't mean that there's a mental health diagnosis. It just means that they've experienced problems due to their gambling behavior. So then on the far right, you'll see gambling disorder of the spectrum. Again, there's really no hard lines between any of these, but you will see that there is a hard line, or a dotted line, I should say, between problem gambling and gambling disorder. What is the big difference between those two things? Yes, a gambling disorder is more severe than a gambling problem in some cases, but really the biggest difference is a diagnosis. It's a mental health diagnosis, just like depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder. It's a mental health diagnosis. It's really important to remember because it's very similar to other addictions and other mental health diagnoses. And so problem gambling is really this umbrella term for any time somebody experiences gambling problems, due to their gambling. A gambling disorder is that small percentage of people who experience gambling problems to the point that they have been diagnosed by a mental health practitioner. That also includes that that also means that they've sought out mental health help and support because of their gambling problems. I do want to point out that I mentioned it's a mental health diagnosis, and that's in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, number 5, the 5th version, so the DSM-5, and it's actually classified, gambling disorder is classified in with the other addictive disorders, and it's important to note that this is the first behavioral addiction that's included in the DSM. So it's an issue. There are other behavioral addictions being researched, but gambling disorder has been researched for a number of years, and they found that it was apparent enough and the evidence was strong enough to include it as a mental health diagnosis in the DSM-5 this year.
Often a family member will go through a phase or a series of phases when their spouse or significant other family member is experience a gambling problem. And just a note, I will be using family member and spouse interchangeably throughout this webinar, and meaning the same thing. So there are a number of stages, and we're going to go through them today. And the information is the chart itself, called A Chart on the Effects of Compulsive Gambling on the Spouse, was developed by Sheila and Arnie Wexler. And that's what we're going to be going over for the bulk of this webinar. So the stages tend to be progressive. Usually people go through all of the stages, and it will spend varied amounts of time in each of those stages. So right now we are going to take a look at the first stage, which is the denial phase. And nope, not the river in Egypt, but I hope you appreciate my graphics here. So the first stage for family members is denial. And for the family member of a gambler, they might notice that their spouse is engaging in some gambling behavior, but they are choosing to kind of ignore it. They might start to worry about it a little bit, but they're keeping that to themselves. Oftentimes, the spouse will make excuses for the gambler and begin to accept in their own mind that gambling is increasing. When a gambler will talk to their spouse and give reasons or excuses for the gambling, the spouse very often will just accept them easily. And even if they don't make a lot of sense, they're still going to go with that. And this is often called enabling. It's the beginning stages of enabling and letting the gambler continue those actions and making it easy for them to do so. Because at this point during the denial phase, the spouse sees the gambling as temporary and that it's not going to go on forever, and it's just a phase that they're going through. But at the same time, the family member is going to start noticing some unpaid bills and kind of having questions about those, but they won't bring that up to anyone, even to their spouse. So at this stage, it is unlikely that a spouse will seek treatment if they are already engaged in counseling. There are some things that you could listen for, cues about being easily frustrated with their spouse, coupled with gambling language and some self-doubt. And Jamie's going to give us a little quick overview on some gambling terminology for things to listen to.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about when we're talking about individuals who are experiencing a gambling problem, and they experience some of these same phases that the family members and the spouses go through as well. In the denial phase, obviously, the family members and the individuals are saying, I don't have a problem, or it's not a problem, it's just fun, it's just social. But it is important to kind of listen for those cues, whether you're a family member or whether you're a counselor and hearing those things. Some of those things are gambling terminology, such as the over-under or on par or bet on the come or the VIG. Those are some of the things you want to be familiar with. I'm not going to run through all of them to define all of them, but it's important to hear if there's a change in language or somebody using terms that you're not familiar with. Family members might hear those and not know what those mean, or family members know those terms and they're ingrained in their language. It's just a normal term. So if you're a clinician treating family members, you might start hearing those when they were talking about betting on the over-under or betting on the VIG, who's first in what race. And you'll start to hear that increasing, and they may be terms you're familiar with, terms you're not familiar with, or also it could just be that they're constantly or consistently or increasingly talking about how gambling has become a form of entertainment, and now it's the only form of entertainment. So there are lots of cues that family members can really listen to see if gambling is becoming an increasing part of a loved one's life, and also for a clinician to listen to a family member and talking about their experiences at home or experiences in their relationships. Like Rachel mentioned, most people in the denial phase, it's early on, whether in the addiction or in the family member recognizing that something's going on. They're not likely to come out and just say that that's what's happening. But as with any other addiction, it's a little difficult because there aren't any physical cues, but there are lots of language cues that clinicians can listen to find out if a family member might be affected by a gambling problem.
So the next phase that people encounter is the stress phase. And during the stress phase, family members begin to notice the problem gambler spending less time with their family or disengaging from their family or other activities that they used to spend time doing and enjoy doing. The spouse of the gambler begins to feel rejected. They see that the gambler is spending more and more time away from them, and that incites feelings of rejection and also begins to lead to resentment and some arguments between the spouse and the gambler. The spouse will often attempt to control the gambler and how much they are gambling, and will likely try to make demands about the gambling. The spouse also begins to isolate themselves from their own family and friends. While the gambler is pulling away from them, they begin pulling away from their own support system outside of their spouse. And that's really increases the feelings of resentment for the spouse feeling toward the gambler. The spouse will also cover for the gambler. If they were supposed to be at a family event or a work party and they're not, the spouse is going to cover for them and make up some excuse as to why they're not there, not saying that they are spending time gambling, but that maybe they're sick or something like that, to cover for them and again to enable the gambler. And a large part of why this begins happening is because of the shame that the spouse feels about their spouse's gambling. And they have started pushing away their own confidants to where they are comfortable saying that I'm concerned about my spouse, this is what they're doing, I don't like it, it's making me uncomfortable, it's affecting our lives. And again, during this phase, the stress phase, family members aren't yet likely to be seeking treatment. But if they already are in treatment, some things that you can listen for as their clinician are those statements of extreme frustration and resentment towards their spouse, the gambler. You might start hearing financial concerns or worries about debt. And just also recognize that deep feeling of stress because of the isolation that they're feeling and shame.
I'm sorry to cut in, Rachel. That stress and that isolation, really, the stress causes the isolation, right? And so sometimes they also experience this level of shame. Rachel mentioned shame a couple times. We as addiction professionals, and those of you who are listening who are addiction professionals, we understand addiction in general, and hopefully you have a fairly basic understanding of gambling addiction as it relates to other addictions. There's often this level of shame, and as addiction professionals, so often we want to say, why can't you just stop? And think about how stressful that is for a family member who doesn't understand addiction or doesn't understand gambling addiction. And so if we don't talk about gambling as an addiction or how gambling can become a problem, family members and spouses are much less likely to come forward and say, my loved one has a problem, it's affecting me. So like Rachel mentioned, you might see that they start complaining about financial issues. You might start hearing that gambling terminology or gambling as their only form of recreation, those sorts of things coming through. And a lot of times that shame really gets fed from the fact that gambling is a hidden addiction. We can see heroin addiction, we can see alcohol addiction, we can smell nicotine addiction. Gambling addiction is very easy to hide. We call it the hidden addiction because you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you can't test for it. There's no urinalysis or blood culture to test for that. And so we as addiction professionals need to make sure that we're talking about it enough that folks know gambling can become a problem and it's okay for me to ask for help, or it's okay to admit that somebody else's gambling is a problem and it's causing problems for me. We need to reduce the stigma and reduce the shame that people feel because they can't control their loved one. The finances really play a big part in this too, because just as a culture, we don't talk about finances. I wouldn't ask you how much you make, and if I did, you wouldn't be comfortable with me asking you how much you make. We don't talk about finances in general, and so that adds to that level of shame that sometimes people feel about not being able to control not just their addiction, but just their finances in general. And so that shame really runs high with family members. So I just wanted to make a point on that really quick while we were talking about the stress phase, because it's really everything's kind of coming to a head. They're feeling increasing stress, they're hiding it because they have increased shame, and so it's really bringing us back down into that progression to the next phase.
Yeah, and Jamie, thank you for talking about that hidden addiction. That's one of the things that really makes gambling addiction so very different from the other addictions. While they do have so many similarities. And if you are familiar with the Jellicoe curve, you know, you're right on track with us. These stages and phases that we're going through are not dissimilar to that for the person who is addicted. So the next phase that we're going to be talking about is the exhaustion phase. So when somebody reaches the exhaustion phase, they are beyond struggling. And this is where you will see changes in a person. Even if you are not their clinician, you might notice changes in someone if you are their coworker or their friend. They are likely to have impaired thinking or confusion. They might have displays of rage as an outlet to their frustration, and often rage tends to be displaced. So other people are likely to see that. The spouse or the family member are beginning to doubt their own sanity. They have been listening to a web of lies from the gambler, and they've been willing to accept those to some extent. So now they don't even know what is true and what is reality and where am I at. So that leaves people vulnerable to experiencing anxiety or panic attacks. Family members are also likely to experience physical symptoms, not surprisingly, like insomnia, headaches or migraines, muscle tension, and digestive problems. Also, the balancing of financial woes. You know, bills are coming in. What am I going to pay this month? You know, it gets to be actually exhausting. So this phase is really well titled. So this is where you might begin to see family members seeking help. Female partners are more likely to seek out support for their spouse's gambling problem than males. And some of the ways that people get to treatment are maybe they had an outburst of rage at work, and they've been referred through their EAP services, or they've been experiencing physical symptoms and gone to their doctor, who's referred them to see a mental health provider. Or they had a panic attack when the mail carrier came to their house, knowing that they were going to be delivered a stack of bills that they were just unsure of how they were going to pay them. So I'm going to ask Jamie right now if she'll talk a little bit about rates for intimate partner violence that we see happening, especially during this phase as well.
Right. So Rachel mentioned a lot of the things, right, we start to doubt are in the exhaustion phase. If I'm a spouse or family member of a problem gambler, I start to doubt my own sanity. I'm dealing with insomnia, digestive problems, financial woes, panic attacks when the mail carrier comes to the house because I don't know what bills are coming, figuring out how to rob Peter to pay Paul and maybe cover everything up. And one of the things that happens a lot in these relationships with really any addiction, but it's particularly high among those struggling with gambling problems, is intimate partner violence, which you may have known as domestic violence before, but IPV or intimate partner violence. The rates are very high in families who are dealing with gambling problems. And most of the time, folks will say, well, right, it's the gambler who gets angry because he or she loses and takes it out on a family member. That's not always the case. About 30% of those involved in a family with a gambling problem have said that they've experienced intimate partner violence. That goes both ways. Sometimes the gambler is the perpetrator. Either he or she is upset, angry because life is spiraling out of control. And then sometimes they are the victim. So for example, if I have a gambling problem and my spouse is giving me a hard time about it, I may become abusive toward my spouse, and that may result in intimate partner violence, right? That's what that is. I'm abusive to my spouse because my spouse is the gambler, or he or she is abusive to me if I'm the gambler. So it really goes both ways. A lot of folks think it's just the gambler on the family member, but intimate partner violence in these families goes both ways. So that may be something else that you might see. And that's really gonna start bringing out this exhaustion phase if you have to deal with that, with intimate partner violence at home, or if you're the perpetrator of it, you're gonna be carrying that around with you on top of all the other stresses and woes that you're dealing with in this stage,
So when we talk about helplessness, this is where people know it as hitting rock bottom. So if a family member isn't already engaged in treatment, this is the time that you are most likely to see them entering treatment. When people reach this point, they are feeling desperate. Feelings of helplessness and hopelessness are very prevalent. And sometimes we might see people have a mental breakdown also. At this time, a family member might also begin to engage in their own substance use or misuse or other compulsive behavior. Because at this point, people are looking for something to control, and this is an outlet to do that, albeit an unhealthy one, but it still is serving a purpose for them.
Rachel, is that sort of like self-medication when you're thinking about other addictions? Would that be a way that they're using to cope with that, like self-medication?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. And then this is also the time where a spouse will decide that they want to get a divorce. They feel like they have reached a point with their spouse that they can't go any further, they can't do this anymore, and it feels like leaving them, getting out of this relationship is the best or only way to make this stop for them. And sadly, there is also higher rates of suicidal ideation for family members of a problem gambler. So that might be another thing to make sure that you are discussing with your clients in treatment. The family member will, at this stage, feels at a total loss. They don't know what to do from here. So not only is their relationship with their spouse in ruin, they have isolated themselves from other support systems that they have, and they are, not feeling confident with themselves at all and unsure of themselves and, even unsure, like, am I having rational thoughts? Couple that with the financial stress that comes along with problem gambling. This is a very scary place to be. So again, it's no surprise that by the time people reach this point, they are reaching out for help. So in this stage, people need help. They need help in the stages before, but at this point, they see that they need help too. So although it's a difficult process, there is hope to cycle through and be on the upswing and get to a healthy place, especially with the help of professionals like you. So right now we're going to move into talking about the next phase, the critical phase.
Rachel, and I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off for a second. The critical phase, right, is so we've kind of gone down an addiction, and similar to the Jellinek curve, we've gone down and we've hit rock bottom, which is that hopelessness phase. And then when we get the help and we're coming out, these are sort of the phases of recovery, or what a family member might experience when their loved one is in recovery from gambling addiction.
Not necessarily when the family member is in recovery, but it's a type of recovery for the family member themselves. So this is the first phase in which the family member will have a positive progression towards something. This is really sensitive phase, and it's really exciting too. I love the name for it because this does feel like a critical turning point for people. In this phase, people can get to regardless of whether or not the gambler is starting treatment as well. The spouse at this point is going to see that there is hope, and they're going to feel hope. And when that feeling kicks in, we're going to actually be able to see changes for the positive in the spouse. So the family member will begin to understand that their spouse is suffering from a disease, and they'll begin to understand that gambling addiction is a disease, and that it's not a character fault of their spouse, where previously they had very much been blaming the individual and not seeing that this is a disease. So they're going to stop providing bailouts to their spouse. They're going to stop that enabling, stop making excuses, and even finding money to gamble with or to pay the bills with. They're going to make some real changes in their lives, and they're going to be able to start seeing some of those positive traits in themselves. They're going to do a personal inventory of themselves that's realistic and see that they are worth making these positive changes. And through that, they're going to start letting their supports back in. They're starting to see the light through this shame that they had been hiding under for so long. And they're going to be able to progress from here. I think this is a really exciting phase to be in. And they can go through these phases with the help of a therapist and allow themselves to heal. And sometimes this can happen in tandem with the gambler, and that's even more exciting to know that both people are healing and becoming more healthy. But sometimes the gambler does not reach this phase at the same time, but it's important to know that for the family member, they can still work through the phases and keep moving up. So the next phase is called the rebuilding phase. And at this point, you're going to see the family member become more and more like their former self. They are learning to handle the resentment that they were feeling towards the gambler. They are able to make realistic plans and decisions for themselves and their future, and what is that going to look like, and including financial decisions too. We know that, of course, problem gambling comes with a lot of financial challenges, and working through this curve, moving in on the upswing, part of that is working through the financial challenges that they've been handed. And a little bit later on, we're going to talk a bit about some financial considerations and ways to work with clients to help them through financial aspects specifically. During this rebuilding phase, they are also recreating a closeness within their family that had been disconnected before. And through this, while this is happening, self-esteem is increasing as the guilt is decreasing. People are able to see that it is a disease and I didn't do it. It's not my fault. I can learn to understand this, but it doesn't mean that I have to be to blame for it. And the spouse is able to recognize their own needs. For so long, they were worried about other people and taking care of other people and finances that they really got neglected. So during this rebuilding phase, family members are able to spend some time on themselves and understand what they need, and also gain some perspective on those around them. So for me, the highlight of this phase is stepping out of that shame that they had been feeling and walking into some self-confidence. The next phase, the final phase really here is the growing phase. So during the growing phase, family members are able to meet their own needs. In the previous phase, they had thought a lot about themselves, but now they're able to put this into action and make the time for themselves. They're allowing themselves to be more affectionate and trusting people that they had previously shut out. They're able to have a sense of achievement and be proud of the things that they're doing, the places that they had come from, and the growth that they are moving into. Oftentimes, people during this phase are able to sacrifice for others. We see people who are in recovery for their family members' addiction engaging in some kind of volunteer activities, just getting involved in their community and sharing their experiences that they had during the throes of their spouses or loved ones' addiction. And beautifully, they're able to relax. The stress level is so much lower. They're able to see things around them that they hadn't noticed before, the little things in life, and appreciate them. And do you have anything else that you want to add onto this slide, Jamie?
No, I think I love that you said they're finally able to relax, because, right, we saw all the stress of the downward spiral of dealing with a loved one's addiction, and then the decision at bottom or wherever they turned up to make that decision, that critical and, okay, I'm going to make a change, and then the rebuilding, like, yes, I'm building, and that it's been so much stress and then so much work to try to recover, that this phase is so nice because they're able to, like you said, just relax and be themselves and not personalize everybody else's issues, be able to separate and create a little bit of a wall. Even if it is a loved one or a spouse or somebody that lives with you, you still have to really put up a wall and protect yourself a little bit sometimes. So this is the best part, when you can see people who finally come all that way, be able to kind of let that air out that they've been holding on that whole time and just relax and let go a little bit and be themselves again, and not have to feel stress or have to really work really, really hard. I mean, every day is work when you're in recovery, whether you're an individual in recovery or a family member in recovery. Every day is work, but really being able to let that sigh out and kind of take a break and enjoy life. So that's exciting.
Yeah, I agree. And I like how you said, setting boundaries and sticking to them, and those can feel really powerful for somebody who is in this phase of recovery. Stick to those boundaries because you set them for a reason, and you thought about them when you were in a really healthy place, and they can help you maintain, this growth that you're experiencing. So now we'll just go through a quick recap of the phases, and it'll show that curve similar to the Jelinek curve, where we start in denial, where we see an acceptance or thinking that it's going to be just a quick thing and they're going to be over it. Or once we do realize that maybe it's going to stick around, I'm going to ignore that could be a problem. I don't want to see that, and I'm just going to let it happen out of my sight. And then we move into the stress phase, where it just becomes very difficult to navigate. Your family member is gambling more and more. It's financially becoming very challenging to meet the demands, to pay the bills and get things through. And I'm really starting to feel resent towards that family member or spouse. At the same time, pulling away from all the relationships around me, my support system that kept me going. So that, takes us down a little bit further into that exhaustion phase. And at this point, things are piling on thick, and the spouse of the gambler is really having a hard time, and they just don't even know where they are at. They don't feel like they are based in reality. And we might, again, this is where we see like those big behaviors, the rage, an outburst, a panic attack or anxiety attack. And from there, just most people will sink a little bit deeper until they feel that hopelessness. And just to back up for a second, it's important to note that this is the curve that most people take. There are people who will get to exhaustion and then be able to move into the critical phase without having hit that rock bottom, or people who will have a more slight curve and from stress phase be able to get into one of the more recovery-oriented phases. But generally speaking, this is the way that people move through these phases. So in that hopelessness phase, that rock bottom is where people are at their worst and they know that they cannot continue like this anymore. And they are, if they haven't already, they are seeking help. And from there, we can really start to see some changes. In that critical phase, we're on the upward swing now. This can be a very powerful time where people are, they have looked for help, they're getting help, and there's a lot of different ways to get help, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And we can see them, they understand addiction and how it has changed their spouse, and inadvertently they can look back and see all the changes that happened to them and around them are because of this addiction. And once they have a solid understanding of that, we can keep going up further in this curve, up into that rebuilding phase, where they're no longer blaming specifically the person. Yes, there were some behaviors that were not okay, but it is due to that addiction. And we can kind of separate the person from the addiction and begin to build trust around us. And if the gambler is not, seeking treatment and learning to stop and change their lives, the spouse can still begin to learn to trust, even though they may need to separate their relationship with the gambler. They're not likely to rebuild trust with the gambler if they continue to gamble, but they can rebuild trust with those other relationships outside of that relationship with the gambler. Because remember, they had cut out all those people, isolated themselves from all the supports around them. And then that last phase, that growing phase where people really can develop that sense of self and give to other people as well. It's really amazing to see people who have gone through these phases, and recovery happens for family members as well. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I know we've already said it, but it can happen without the gambler. Ideally, it's both, but realistically, it's not always. So,
Rachel, I like how you sum that up. It's almost like on the left-hand side, we have the denial, stress, exhaustion. I see that as there's not a problem. Okay, there's a problem. It's starting to affect me. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. And then that hopelessness hitting rock bottom, like, uh-oh, here we are. I have no idea how to dig us out of this. I have no idea how we got there. And then the other side, the critical rebuilding and growth phases on that upswing of recovery, like the critical, okay, I'm going to make a change, the rebuilding, like really working to make those changes within yourself. And then that growth mindset of, I'm looking forward. I'm not looking at my current situation. I'm not looking at what somebody did to me or how I felt about that. Like, I'm actually looking forward. So I think that's a really nice portrayal of kind of how it affects a family member, but then also the positive side of there is a way out. And you mentioned even if the gambler isn't seeking treatment or support or recovery support, peer support in some way, that the family member, him or herself, can seek support and can start to work on themselves and feel better and build that self-esteem and grow with or without the gambler. So that's exciting to know. As you mentioned, ideally it happens together, but it doesn't have to. So some things that we want to talk about, we've mentioned, I know that it doesn't always have to be money, and we mentioned that, but a lot of times gambling and gambling problems and addiction does involve money, which really takes a strain on the family. There are lots of other issues, mental health issues, suicidal ideation issues, trust and relationship breakages, employment issues, and lots of things going on. But a lot of the questions that we get are, well, what do I do financially? If I'm a loved one of a problem gambler, what do I do financially? And just some signs or some tools, just some things I want to touch on really quickly and really briefly. I'm not an expert in the financial world. I wish I was, but I am not. But just some things. Rachel mentioned bailout, and that doesn't mean bailout of jail, but bailout as in I'll give you more money to pay the rent because you spent the money gambling, or I'll give you money to pay off your gambling debt. Something that a spouse or a family member should consider is that we recommend not giving bailout because that's almost a form of enabling. You mentioned early on in that stress or the denial phase, and even maybe some of the stress phase, Rachel mentioned that family members are likely to give bailout or feel compelled to give bailout. You want to help, and I get that. You want to help the gambler or help the family out of the debt, but that's not always the best idea. If you have joint accounts, I would recommend, or we would recommend, right, joint accounts, making sure that your money is safely, that you have some separation of finances too. Rachel mentioned that it's ideally the gambler and the family member seek treatment and support together, but that's not always the case. So just making sure that you protect yourself. They always say you can't fill somebody else's bucket until you've filled your own bucket. So making sure that you are kept safe and creating those boundaries. Limiting access to funds if it's possible, putting a limit on debit card and credit card transactions, again, just limiting access, setting a really healthy, realistic budget, and that may mean separating finances. There's always credit counseling agencies too. There are free credit counseling agencies, don't pay for them. There are free credit counseling agencies, don't pay for them. I will repeat that. When we talk about our contact information and our local support, we can give you access to those credit counseling agencies as well. And then also talking with a GA or a Gamma pressure relief group. Pressure relief is a feature of self-help groups, Gamblers Anonymous and Gamma. And that is where people who have dug themselves out of that financial stress or that financial burden, they support the family member in recovery who is also trying to do the same. So experts can give you as much options as they can and help you with tools, but sometimes it helps to talk to a peer, somebody who's been there before. So just some things financially that a family member will want to consider. And keeping themselves safe financially, we talked about how the finances are sometimes really tied to that shame and guilt of like, I can't control anything, not even my bills or my income. Addressing the finances can help empower the family member so that it can help them progress through those phases of recovery so that they can grow and again, empower them, increase their self-esteem, and help them on that upswing of recovery.
Yeah, and just keep in mind, one of the outward signs of gambling addiction is mounting financial debt. So when you're working with a family member of a problem gambler, money is one of the things that you'll need to work with whoever it is you're doing the treatment with, because money is the only thing that a gambler will need to make another bet. I know we talked a little bit about something of value, but for most forms of gambling that people are engaging in by the time that they are a disordered gambler require money. So these financial considerations can be very important for stopping, stopping that access.
Absolutely. Something else that we want to just touch on is the co-occurring diagnosis and disorders between gambling addiction and other mental health diagnoses such as other addictions, so alcohol use disorder, substance use disorder, and then mood disorders, etc. Well over half of people who have a gambling addiction also have some sort of other addiction. That could be alcohol, it could be cocaine, it could be heroin, it could be nicotine dependence. There are a lot of there's a lot of comorbidity between those issues. So sometimes we'll see those other addictions first because the gambling addiction can be hidden. So that's something important to think about. And again, the family members are going to be affected by those other addictions as well. So if you're dealing with a family member who's being affected by somebody else's other addiction or disorders, it's important to ask about gambling addiction. Mood disorders, especially depression, really run concurrently with gambling addiction. And when you're talking about family members, I think it's something upwards of like 90% of people who have a loved one who suffers problems due to their gambling express that their mental health suffers. So it may not be a diagnosable depression, it may not be diagnosable anxiety, but we all know that prevention is the best cure, right? Let's stop that before it becomes depression or anxiety. So if you're starting to see depression, anxiety in your clients, other addiction disorders, they could be using it for coping if their loved one is gambling. It's important to think in the back of your mind that gambling could be playing a role in whatever's going on in their lives. So again, as you hear about the stages of compulsive gambling on the spouse, these other mental health diagnoses can take place with the gambler, him or herself, but can also affect the family member. And so if your client displays any correlated mental health diagnoses, any of other addiction disorders, mentions financial stress, the diagnostic screen you can see on the screen is called the brief biosocial gambling screen. And really it's for the gambler, but it may help you as a clinician to identify if the family member that you see in treatment, if he or she is being affected by somebody else's gambling. It talks about in the past 12 months becoming restless, irritable, or anxious when trying to stop or cut down on gambling. We know that that is the classic sign of withdrawal because you take something away from somebody who's addicted and they experience withdrawal. During the past 12 months, have you tried to keep your family or friends from knowing how much you gambled? So you may have people who have moved from the denial phase into that stress phase. The family members may express that their loved one lies to them, or that's how they discovered they had a problem because he or she was lying to them. And the other thing to keep an eye out for, again, the brief biosocial gambling screen asks about the financial trouble. When I talked about gambling or problem gambling earlier on in the presentation, I expressed that problem gambling is anytime your gambling causes a problem. It could be a mental health problem, addiction problem, a job problem, but in your clients you may see it come out as a financial problem. So that's something that's important to look out for. Again, this screen, the brief biosocial gambling screen, is specific to a gambler, but those cues such as lying, going through withdrawal, preoccupation, talking about it all the time, experiencing financial problems as well as other problems, those are all things that are going to affect a family member, not just the individual who's gambling.
Yeah, and beyond this brief biosocial gambling screen, there are other screens that are available as well. There is another brief screen called the Lie Bet, and there is also a longer one used for diagnostic criteria called the SOGS, the South Oaks gambling screen, and those are available to use as well.
Thank you, Rachel. So what do we do now that we know what problem gambling looks like, how it affects a family member? What do we do about that? What are some resources? Now, we're going to cover a few resources today. Hopefully both of them will be, or a few of them will be one-stop shopping. We're not going to be able to give you like the whole gamut of resources. Just know that there are resources out there. I want to let you know how to access a few of them. This is my spiel. Because we're from the New York Council on Problem Gambling, our aim is to help professionals who are working in the field and to educate professionals and support professionals who are encountering problem gamblers as well as who are encountering family members. Rachel mentioned very early on that oftentimes a family member will reach out before the gambler, him or herself, will reach out. And so you'll see the family member will have that aha moment a lot of times before the gambler will, just because that denial phase lasts a little bit long when you're the person who's experiencing that, the priority shift. So at the New York Council on Problem Gambling, we have a number of statewide initiatives surrounding prevention, treatment, recovery, information gathering, et cetera. Those are important to think about. Our annual conference, I'd like to do a plug for that, is November 20th, 21st, and 22nd this year. It is a whopping $50 if you want to come, or just call me and we'll make sure we can get you in. We do 2.5 days for our annual conference in Albany. We can offer training and support to anybody who wants it. If you're a clinician who just has questions and needs information, you can reach out to us. If you're a workplace or an employer who needs information, reach out. We can help anybody, and if we're not the right people, we'll find them for you. We do have Youth Decide, which is a little bit different. It's about empowering youth to make the right decisions about gambling by helping them to understand media and how the media can affect your decisions when encountering gambling. So talking about gambling advertisements and how those perpetuate the myths and facts associated with gambling. We do have local providers. We're covering 23 counties this year, so it's likely we have one in your area. And then Know the Odds. Know the Odds is a really important one. It's just as you see it on the screen, knowtheodds.com, or .org, excuse me. And you can go there. That's geared toward community members, but there's a lot of information on there for family members who are affected as well. And then our website is on there. And we have a new initiative that I'm going to let Rachel talk about happening in New York State.
So new in New York State, almost entirely covering New York State at this point, and by August we will be covering all of New York State, our problem gambling resource centers. So if you are looking for help because you are adversely affected by gambling, you can call the Problem Gambling Resource Center, or as we refer to them as the PGRCs. They can help you find so many resources in your area. When somebody calls the regional PGRC, we can connect that caller to whatever type of help it is that they're looking for related to problem gambling. Oftentimes we are talking to either a family member or a gambler themselves who is looking for treatment. Through the PGRCs, we have a network of private practitioners that we have trained and vetted that we are able to refer callers to. And these practitioners are able to provide group or individual or family therapy to the caller seeking services. And I also want to make it clear that if they are not meeting all diagnostic criteria, we are still able to send them to treatment, and if their insurance won't accept billing for it, we're able to reimburse for those services because it's really important for us to reduce barriers to get people the help that they're looking for. We'd rather get them in early, before they've reached that helplessness phase. Like if we see them at stress, we want to get them in into treatment. Also, the PGRCs have contacts and schedules for local Gamblers Anonymous meetings and Gam-Anon meetings and other recovery networks, including Smart Recovery, and can make connections with other recovery resources in the region.
Something I want to point out really quickly is Rachel mentioned when a call comes in, we match them with the best care possible. So we have this clinical network that we're working with to get up and running to reach the areas where there aren't OASAS providers, but we can also refer to OASAS approved providers. And so we're working with the entire network, whether that means self-help or it means a formalized brick and mortar system or it means a private practitioner in their neighborhood. Our goal is to make sure that the entire state of New York is covered with treatment so that nobody has to leave their community or within a reasonable distance from their community to seek treatment. So we can funnel to our clinical network of private practitioners, but also to OASAS approved providers. So what we're hoping is that empowers individuals who are reaching out. We can make sure that they get from point A when they're in that critical phase and say, I need help now, when they make that decision, to point B at at the office, at the OASAS office, or at the private practitioner's office so they can get treatment immediately.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jamie. And then I'm just bragging about the PGRCs and this great network we've got of clinicians, but it is very important to note that we can also make connections to those OASAS providers that are able to treat problem gamblers as well. And then also, if somebody is looking for self-exclusion, we can help connect them to those services. There are so many resources that are available through the Problem Gambling Resource Center. And the staff there is able to tailor training needs to whatever your target audience is. So if you'd like a presentation for any of your groups, contact Jamie. And if you are a private practitioner interested in joining our network, you can contact me. And actually our information will be right up on the next slides.
So one thing before I go to our contact information, I want to point out is that the Problem Gambling Resource Centers are not meant to replace any services. It's meant to increase access to services. And really what I tell people when they say, I don't understand, what are you doing? We just want to be one-stop shopping for anyone who wants information, treatment, support, training, materials, anything related to problem gambling. So if you need information about problem gambling, call your Problem Gambling Resource Center or go to the website on the screen, nyproblemgamblinghelp.org, and they can direct you. Again, our hope is that these Problem Gambling Resource Centers are one-stop shopping for anything related to problem gambling. And if you're not sure where to reach out or who to reach out to, Rachel Loria and Jamie Cassell at the New York Council on Problem Gambling, our information is up there, and you can check it out on our website. So I think that's it. I want to say thank you for everybody who came today. Rachel, do you have any closing remarks?
No, just thank you very much. And please, if you have questions or would like more information about problem gambling or joining our clinical network, any of those things, please reach out to us.
Thank you, everyone, for helping problem gamblers in New York State and also supporting and helping the families who are affected by problem gambling.
I want to thank our presenters for today's informative program. I hope you'll all find it useful while assisting clients in need of services. Your feedback is important to us. It helps us to know if we are meeting your educational goals, needs, and expectations. Once you have viewed the presentation in its entirety and completed the quiz, please follow directions to access the SurveyMonkey website and take a moment to complete the evaluation. Once again, thank you for joining us and keep up the good work.